So my name is Iain Stewart, and one way the geosciences advance sustainability is by delivering on improved human well-being.
Welcome to SEG's Seismic Sound Off, conversations with geoscientists addressing the challenges of energy, water, and climate. I'm your host, Andrew Gary. In this powerful episode, expert geoscience communicator Iain Stewart opens our eyes to the hidden commons of the subsurface. Iain challenges us to rethink our relationship with the subsurface, outlining his vision of the subsurface as a new frontier, not just for resource exploitation, but as a space for sustainable development and urban innovation. This conversation tackles the geoscientist's dual role as earth steward and resource extractor, emphasizing the importance of conveying geoscience's relevance to the public and decision makers. Iain's expertise shines as he shares the greatest value of geoscientists and why studying geology is important. This episode will inspire you and help give geoscientists a new language to talk about the importance of their work to the world. Please check out the show notes for this episode's links and references. Let's get to my conversation with Iain Stewart. I'm excited to speak with you, Iain. You are an expert in geoscience communication. It's fun to have those type of people inclined to be great speakers on the podcast. And you're currently serving as the inaugural research chair in sustainability at the Royal Scientific Society. That might be new to a lot of listeners. What is your role in this position?
I think it'll be new to most people. It was new to me as well.
It's the inaugural chair, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it'll be the last as well, No, so the Royal Scientific Society is a technical and scientific organization in Jordan in the Middle East. It's an interesting organization because it's a non-profit, non-governmental organization that gives scientific and technical advice to government, to business, to communities, to universities. What I think is unique about it is that we have 500 odd scientist specialists, lots of scientific labs, testing, monitoring, etc. So that's not especially new. We have research centers that focus on particular themes. So water, environment, climate, you can imagine in this region of the world is really important. Energy, particularly clean energy, but energy all the same. In Jordan, we don't have much fossil fuels, or if anything. And buildings and infrastructure. But the thing that makes it truly interesting is our patron is Prince Hassan, who's a great humanitarian, and his daughter is our president, is my boss. And again, she's a great humanitarian. She's the Goodwill Ambassador for UNESCO for Science and Peace. So you have this organization that goes from science and testing products. Virtually every product that comes in or out of Jordan goes through our laboratories, all the way through to this humanitarian issue about how can we improve the human conditions, refugees, human security, etc. So that breadth is quite extraordinary. And that's one of the things that attracted me, was to be a science communicator in such a broad portfolio.
That must be an exciting way to use your skills and your abilities. You call it something the hidden commons, and it's a phrase I have not heard. What do you mean by that phrase?
Well, it's one of those phrases you invent and then you seek to define it thereafter. So, but the hidden so the idea of the tragedy of the commons is a very obvious and well rehearsed story about resource availability and exploitation. But for me, the hidden commons is the subsurface. So one of the things that I think geoscience has been poor at exploiting is that we have a unique domain that no one else touches, and that is the subsurface. So we often fight over the surface domains, and lots of the issues that geoscience talk about that they deal with that surface and very near surface environment. And that mixes up with geography, it mixes up with the other sciences. The subsurface world is ours. No one else wants it. That's the problem. And the thing is that the ownership of the subsurface is a really interesting debate. Who owns the subsurface as you go down into a few kilometers? There's the old idea if you own a parcel of land, you own from the heavens above to the center of the earth, this wedge that goes all the way down. But whenever that's tested in court, it's thrown out. You can't You can't own something that's 1,000 kilometers down or 300 kilometers down or 100 kilometers down. You can own something a few meters down. And that comes in with things like fracking for shale gas, and it came in with CCS. In other words, do you own the rock that's immediately under the rock mass that's immediately underneath your house? And the reality in the courts is you don't own that because you can't exploit it, but it has implications. So the hidden commons for me is this business is this huge resource that as we move into the future and we think about sustainable development and all its different dimensions, is the parts of the subsurface that's going to be critical for sustainable development is the realm of geoscientists. And therefore, we should be exploiting our knowledge of the hidden commons. And the challenge is to justify that and to sell that to the public and the politicians, the decision makers, say this is an important frontier. And that frontier has got, the exploitation of resources, but it's also places that we may store stuff, whether it goes from rad waste to, hydrogen, all the way through to extracting stuff. But it's more than that. It's the realization that in many parts of the world, the future of cities is probably going to lie in the deep subsurface. The vertical urbanism we've built up the way, but what about down the way? And as climate change and places get, for example, temperatures in the tropics get warmer, then more and more of life's activities are going to start happening in the subsurface of cities and things like that. And if you're building in the subsurface of cities, you absolutely need a geoscientist to be doing that. So the hidden commons for me is that notion of a new frontier that if we can sell it right, is completely unique to ourselves.
So you have this new frontier that the governance can be a little complicated and difficult to figure out. The stewardship, piggybacking on that, who is responsible for it if no one really owns it, or we can't figure out who owns it. And you talk about building empathy for the subsurface. Do you think that is the proper direction for geoscientists to go to get people to care about what is happening in these hidden commons?
Yeah, I tell you why. What really perplexes me is we have this fascination for space, don't we? We stare up at the heavens and we look out at that starry sky and we go, wow. And anything, I've done a lot of television and we stayed away from space science because it had an amazing audience and that audience loves space and they'll just devour anything about space. But here's the thing. It's broadly empty up there. That, these planets that we look at are millions of miles apart. We'll never reach most of them. It's empty. And most of the stuff we can never access. And yet the irony is underneath our feet is a bunch of stuff that we can access and is really useful. So why is it that space has got that emotional appeal? And how can we translate that into an emotional appeal for the subsurface? And we kind of know we can, the Jules Verne, Journeys to the Center of the Earth, how many movies, usually bad movies, but how many movies do we think about is descending into the planet, So I kind of think that if we've got a bit of imagination amongst our community, we can start to sell this idea of what would happen if we took a fraction of the budget that we do to go up into space and go off hunting for meteorites or moon or Mars, a fraction of that to go down into the earth. And I think that selling this idea that if you become a geoscientist in the 21st century, the frontier is not up there in the sky, but is down there underneath your feet. If we can do that, if we can find narratives and stories for that, then we make geoscience a much more attractive option.
You talk about geoscientists dealing with this dilemma where at once they're the Earth steward, they're trying to find oil and gas and other things and use them as well as they can. And then they're also exploiting those by getting those things by mining and getting the oil and gas out of the earth, out of the subsurface. How do you think about that dilemma for a geoscientist?
Yeah, they're end members of a continuum. So I think that at one extreme is we're nasty people that just extract stuff from the earth and we're horrible and it's all this kind of stuff. And there's plenty of examples of that rhetoric. At the other end, there's this notion that we are these guardians of the planet because we've spent all of our time studying its 4.5 billion year history, all its rhythms. We know that we know how it operates as a system. Your average geoscientist probably sits somewhere in the middle, and probably over the course of their career may move from one into another area. I don't know a geoscientist that doesn't care deeply about the Earth. I mean, even people who work in the front line of oil exploration and mineral exploration still don't want to see themselves as polluters or the spoilers of the Earth, because that's the reason they got interested in the first place. But they carry a responsibility to deliver stuff for society. Modern world wants lots of materials, and the materials generally come from the earth. The old adage, if you can't grow it, it comes from the earth. It's dug from the earth. So I think that we have this slightly ambivalent, perhaps even kind of schizophrenic view of the flipping, from one side to the other as geoscientists. But the reality is that most of us are somewhere in the middle about how we do it. My take is that I think that if we can push and emphasize the fact that we're Earth stewards, that even if we're resource exploiters, we want to do so in a sustainable way, and we're not there for a fast buck, just to get in there and boom and bust, which we've got lots of examples of. That if we can convey this notion that we're Earth stewards, Earth guardians, that's a more positive and progressive view than we're just there to take stuff from the earth because we can, because we have the knowledge and we have the right. I don't think it's as a tenable viewpoint in this part of the 21st century.
Before this position, you were at the Sustainable Earth Institute, and you've been in this field of geoscience communication and being a professional for years. Do you feel like now the conversation around climate change, the energy transition, is kind of one of an agreement on kind of some basic facts and let's look ahead? Or do you still feel like you're informing and educating people on where the earth is and where it might be going?
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think geologists have struggled to position themselves here. Geologists are simple people. We're very simple people. Our subject hasn't changed much in 100 years, 150 years. And we've got a very strong sense of legacy of this is the way we were trained and this is the way we will train other people. And I think there's something nice about that, but I think it's held us back. I think when the whole climate change came around, geologists did not like that at all. We knew that climate changed dramatically over geological time, and we have lots, and there are still a few pockets of this, of saying, that natural climate change is what's driving it all. And especially because the two vocational areas that took most of our graduates, mining and particularly oil and gas, were kind of deemed as the irresponsible parts of this and get demonized and all the rest of it. So we got very defensive and very protective. And I think what that meant was that it took a long time for geologists to get on board with the climate change agenda. And one of the things we missed was a lot of the evidence for climate change was coming in decadal records, so annual to decadal records, ice cores, tree rings, etc. Geologists don't have decadal records. You may go back in time and the tiniest little mud layer is 100,000 years. We can't do that. So I think that what we as geologists have is a very blood smeared out view of Earth history, but it goes back a long way. And the real challenge with climate change was a very high resolution record for the last few decades. So we were slow to the party and we were very defensive because from either us or our best friends were in this industry that was getting demonized. But I think geologists have always been late to the party. When plate tectonics comes along in the 60s, geologists are the last people to accept it. The geophysicists accept it and all the rest of it. But the geologists are going, no, this fad thing from the oceans talking about plates moving, that's a load of rubbish. And it takes about a decade before mainstream geology accepts it. And now it sits right in the middle of our subject. You can't imagine geology without plate tectonics. I think it's becoming that now in geology because with the idea of climate change and the energy transition, it's kind of nudged and forced its way into the mainstream. And now when we write research grants or we sell ourselves to students, we talk about climate change, we talk about the energy transition, and we talk about the centrality of geology and geologists to that. But it has taken a while. And I do think that we have slightly missed the boat in the policy area. So that when you talk about the big decision makers in this, biodiversity and the biologists have grabbed a lot of the territory. Physicists, a lot of the other sciences are much more mainstream, and geologists are kind of on the edge, knocking on the door saying, what about us? It's about the planet. We study the planet. We should be allowed in. I think if we'd got faster onto that, we would be in a slightly better position. But we're playing catch up. But I think that I don't think there's any doubt that if you look around the way that university courses are reshaping itself, these topics are now become central because they're the topics that the youngsters are interested in, and they're the topics that the jobs are becoming, they're switching across to. So it's a no-brainer.
Do you think that mindset, in particular of a geologist that is looking at millions of years, not looking at a year, do you think that kind of perspective, how do you think that benefits this climate change and energy transition? What unique things do they bring because of that perspective?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot of time about deep time and long time scales, but I think we overplay that hand. I think it is important, and other scientists don't have that longevity of reach in terms of the kind of lines of inquiry. But as I say, I think sometimes that gives us a very smeared out, blurry view of the Earth's past. I think what's better is that multidisciplinary approach that we have. We are essentially an interdisciplinary science. We steal from biology, we steal from physics, we steal from maths, chemistry, we jam it all together, and we call it, geology. And so I think that aspect is important. The problems we have in the modern world need that multidimensional, multidisciplinary approach, and we just take it for granted. I think there's something else as well, and any geologist will know that. We are immersed in uncertainty. Geology always confuses you because, you'll have a geologist will have an outcrop here or some data here, and then several kilometers away, they'll have another set of data, and they'll extrapolate between the two. They'll have some kind of theory that connects. Every other rational science would say, we do not have enough data. We need to go away and get more. But the geologists will say, hey, I think I know how they connect. So we're used to not having full data set. We don't expect to have the full data set because most of it's obscured. And I think that if you take that idea and you translate it into the contemporary world of sustainability, we don't have all the data. There's lots of gaps and uncertainties. But I think the geologist is the one that will make a leap of faith and go, you know what? Based on what I see, this is what I think it is. It'll be nice to have more data. And if we get that, great. But on basis of what we got, this is my guess. I think that's a huge skill. And I don't think the other sciences do that. So my take is that geoscience is a very special discipline. And it throws up a very different way of looking at the world. And that is what our greatest value is. It's not being able to identify muscovite under the microscope or, know certain number of types of rocks or be able to do this geophysics or something. They're skills that are useful, but the mindset that we create in our heads is probably our biggest advantage.
If you were speaking to a mixed audience, so you have geoscientists in the room, you have political leaders in the room, and you have the public in the room, and you're setting the ground rules for a conversation on the future of the subsurface, would there be some things that you would say, this is like an agreed upon, like a red line, essentially, we're basing this conversation on these three things that we know to be true, or from my perspective, I know to be true. Do you have some things that you would say in that presentation of like, we're working from this conversation based on X?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. My take in it is, if you're talking, whoever you're talking to, it's about them. That's the first thing. So you're trying to work out what they're interested in, and then you're trying to bend what you know to them. So I think we often make this mistake of starting where we are and try to impress on people how important our viewpoint is. And I think that from a basic communication point of view, that's flawed. Your communications are bound to fail and not connect if you do it that way. So we have this problem that we've got this very strange, unfamiliar thing that we want to sell, which is this geology world or the subsurface. And we see this a lot when there's controversies about the subsurface. the way that the people see the world down there is, well, usually they've never even thought about it. So if you say something about what do you think's down there, 9 times out of 10, that's the first time anyone's ever even asked that question to them. And people have no reference points apart from maybe some Hollywood movies to think about it. So you got to realize that it's not part of their everyday conversation. So one way that's not bad to do that is to talk about how amazing the world is down there, the subsurface world. What were the things that we do know about it, the fact of just how much of our everyday life we get from the subsurface. And that can at least start you into a conversation with people about that. But I do think that it's a double-edged sword. This alien world that we're talking about is both a hindrance because it's a barrier for people intellectually to get their head around. But equally, it's fascinating because they go, you what? I can't believe you're telling me this. The simplest things, people will say, really? Can that be true? It's because they've never thought about it. So I think it's about really us trying to think about what's our hidden gems, what's our really key stories. And that is that we know quite a lot about the subsurface. And what we know is there's lots of useful stuff down there and lots of fascinating stuff. And we should try and know more about it. And then as we, have that conversation with whoever it is, we can decide how to negotiate and navigate that story based on what the person's interested in, because I think there's lots of different ways that could go.
When we, had the race to the moon in the 60s, the Hubble telescope, some of those pictures and images that we saw really struck the imagination of a lot of the world. Is there something equivalent that you think if the world you were able to capture in the subsurface, or maybe something is going on right now that you think could really serve as this catalyst where people could see the possibilities of what is beneath their feet?
That's a really good question. I mean, what is interesting, you mentioned the Hubble, but the thing that, as you said, that popped into my head is that famous photograph from one of the Apollo mission, Earthrise, which is the shot of the moon barren in the foreground and the Earth resplendent in blue and green arriving on the far thing. And that was something that catalyzed a lot of the environmental activism in the late 60s and early 70s when they had Earth Day. And, this fragile, vulnerable planet, the pale blue dot that Carl Sagan talks about, So I think that this imagery is really important, but I don't think there is one for the subsurface because it's very dark down there. And I know that sounds so trivial, but when you I work a lot in television, and one of the things we come across all the time is amazing stories about the subsurface. But as soon as you try to visualize them, you come up with this problem that you can't, you're talking about visualizing something inside solid rock. And the only way you can play around with that is pretending you're not in solid rock and you can move through it. And then you give them wrong interpretation of how you move through the earth. So people then start thinking there's rivers or there's caves, so it's a really difficult thing. So I think conveying the subsurface in traditional, conventional ways is really problematic. Everyone's seen the film The Core, where they end up in some cave that's in the mantle and they get out. It just gets crazy. But that's what they have to do in order to make sense of that world. So I think that this is where it's quite interesting, the space thing, because some of the ideas of space are really complicated. It's very, very abstract ideas of what some of these features are. But people seem to be okay with that very high level, abstract ideas. I think it's just a case of maybe it's the language of the subsurface we need to start to think about more than the visual language of the subsurface. But maybe it's a little easier in the very near subsurface. I don't know anyone who, if they walk past the deep hole, doesn't look in. Why? Why is that? Why do you stare across it? What's that? There is something there, and it's quite intriguing, mysterious, maybe quite dark. But there's something there. There's an emotional connection to the subsurface. I think the other thing that we've maybe lost is how do other cultures look at the subsurface? How did we look at it before science? I've sometimes used as a slide in some of my talks, the opening sequence in Stranger Things, where you have a surface world and then you have the same world reflected in a darker way in the subsurface. That the subsurface for most people is this dark, mysterious, dangerous place. So that's the rhetoric that's out there already, because bad things come up from, things come up and take you down, come back to Greek mythology, pull you down into the subsurface. So that's all negative. But I think what it's telling is that there is an intrinsic interest in the subsurface. And that if we can understand that and play around with it, there will be good things we can put across, or just fascinating things that we can put across.
If you could snap your finger and either have, the public, the world understand something about the subsurface, or vice versa, maybe something is known, like it becomes a thing that is known about the subsurface, what would that be?
Wow. Do you know what? I'd love to, the outer mantle, that fluid outer mantle. I remember someone telling me that it's got, it's kind of got the viscosity of not water, but it's a very fluid, that is essentially an ocean. And it's got tides and it's got currents and all the rest of it. And just the idea of surfing in the outer mantle ocean is quite a nice idea. So I'd like to know, that's all based on theoretical thermodynamics and, mineral physics and things like that. But I love the idea that there's an interior ocean that we could know more about. And I guess the classic thing that really annoys geologists is the notion that the continents float on this ocean of lava and magma. It's the classic mistake, and geologists go crazy about it. But it's kind of funny because at the end of the day, the reason we have plate tectonics is because the mantle and the asthenosphere is a fluid-like material. It just flows very slowly over geologic time, but it flows. It's a fluid. And so you can kind of understand the general public's confusion as we talk about this thing as a flowing, but it's not a liquid, So I guess my thing would be that idea of deep flows in the earth and how tricky they are to explain, but how enigmatic they would be to experience.
Do you think the bigger evolution in the understanding of the subsurface, or the emphasis on the subsurface, would happen from the general public just understanding it, like the value it brings, or advancing the scientific understanding of the subsurface? Which do you think, if there was a leap in either the scientific advancement or the understanding of it on a public level of what we currently know, what do you think would move the needle more?
Do you know, I'm going to hedge my bet somewhere in the middle, because I think that that there's plenty of scientific and academic things to still discover of the subsurface, but I'm not sure I can imagine one that would just tip the balance and suddenly they'll go, oh my God, that's amazing. And likewise, in terms of the public encounter the subsurface when there's a problem. Fracking, carbon capture storage, I'm worried about this. And all this baggage I was mentioning about the subsurface being this dark and dangerous place that we don't want to go to. I think that one of the things will be geoscientists being able to more convey the subsurface in interesting ways, passionate ways, about why they think it's important in a way, in ways that the public can get and can understand and think, gosh, that's amazing. One of the most amazing places I've ever filmed was in the Crystal Cave of north of Mexico. And this is the Los Cava de Cristales, and it's gypsum crystals. So one of the most basic minerals you get, but they're like 5, 10, 20 meters tall along, it's an extraordinary place. And we had that as a sequence in one of our shows, the first 7 minutes. It is the most extraordinary place. It looks like Superman's ice cave, and lots of people were drawn by this. And we have no idea how common that is, that kind of stuff, because it's a pretty unique place. But there's probably lots of these types of places in the subsurface that we don't know about. So I think there'll be an element of geologists that really understand the subsurface, conveying that understanding in a accessible way to people, and that will be one of the game changers.
What challenge would you like to leave the listener from this conversation?
I think it's how geology improves the human condition. And that sounds very big and, bombastic. But, when geology first emerges as a discipline with James Hutton in the 1780s, the theory of the earth, in its roots, it's the Scottish Enlightenment, or it's the Enlightenment in the UK that then goes into the Industrial Revolution. And the whole thrust of scientific endeavor at that time was to improve the condition of humanity. And the Industrial Revolution was seen as one way of doing that. And geology was tied inextricably to the Industrial Revolution, coal, minerals, etc. We drove it, geoscience drove it. And of course, now those same processes is what's producing climate change and exploitation, biodiversity, a lot, and it's seen as bad. So I think that from geologists' point of view, what we need to do is start to reset the dial a little bit and think, why are we trying to understand the planet? And what Hutton says is, we're trying to understand the planet because we live in a habitable world. In other words, it's our planet that we inhabit. That's why we're trying to, it's the continuation of the sustainability of life. It's why we're studying geology. And I think we need to slightly recapture that when we sell it to our students, etc., is that we're not just a feeder for the minerals industry, or a feeder for the oil and gas industry, or a feeder for this, or engineering, geology. What we're doing is we're trying to understand the planet because we can make it a better place as a result of our knowledge. And that's things like, understanding that our knowledge of geochemistry can help with health issues. It's that a lot of water in many parts of the world, in this part of the world that I am, in the Middle East or in Africa, is groundwater. We know where the groundwater is. We use the same techniques that we use for oil and gas to find the water. So, employ a geologist, we'll find the water for you. So, in a whole set of ways, the geologist, I think, is a key player, really, for humanity in the 21st century. So, but I think it's trying to do that. I think it's trying to make the case that we're more than just that we find oil and gas and we find metals, and that's what what's in your smartphone. Don't you know that a geologist has found that? It's a very one-dimensional argument. I think we need to be broader. We need to say we understand the planet, and we can make your lives better as a result of our understanding of the planet.
Well, Iain, I appreciate your time on this. Thanks for speaking with me. We could definitely go much longer than the time we had allotted. There's a lot to discuss, so maybe we'll have you back for another round.
I'd be very, very pleased to. Fantastic. Thank you for reaching out.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Seismic Sound Off. SCG creates these episodes to celebrate and inspire the geophysicists of today and tomorrow. Visit scg.org to learn more. Email the show at podcast@scg.org. This episode was hosted, edited, and produced by me, Andrew Gary, at Treasurement. The SCG podcast team is Jennifer Cobb, Kathy Gamble, and Allie McGinnis. The podcast will return next week with a new episode. Until then, this is Seismic Sound Off, signaling off.